All right, we are still studying the book of Hebrews, and we're coming into kind of like the finishing touches here. Last week, we went from chapter 5 through chapter 7. Now, I put that check mark on the 5, 6 as orange because we skipped a part that we're coming back to. Um, the flow that part is sort of a sidetrack that the writer got on. The flow went from 5 through 7 without that sidetrack, and that leads us to 8 and 9, which we're not going to get into chapter 9 today, but we're just going to look at chapter 8. Uh, but it's coupled with 9, but we'll see 9 a little bit later. So this is the Testament pivot. And in our chapter today, we run into Hebrews 8:6. Jesus has obtained a more excellent ministry. And we're in 8, but I just want us to keep in mind this passage from Hebrews chapter 4 that says we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. So let us hold fast our profession, for we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. There's a verse in the book of Revelation that says, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Whosoever will, let him come. And I just want to emphasize the overbearing and underlying principle of anything that we read in the Bible is that there is an extended invitation to any and all to come to God. Now, we may have to come to God on his terms and not on our own terms, but the invitation is there, and the access to God is there for any and all. So, going to Hebrews chapter 8. Now, what we looked at last time in 5 through 7 is a particular focus on the priesthood and the Old Testament priests and their ministry being replaced by the priesthood of Jesus, which the Bible describes as being after the order of Melchizedek instead of after the order of Aaron. So that's what we looked at last week. That's a facet of the Old Testament to the New Testament. And then chapter 8, though, is going to give just a little bit bigger context or broader context. So it says, now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such an high priest, or this kind of high priest, who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. So, what is the true tabernacle? Well, in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, there was a tabernacle, which could also be described as a sanctuary, or the Holy of Holies in it, maybe more particularly described as the sanctuary within the tabernacle. And God prescribed it. God gave the instruction for the building of it, but ultimately it was the hands of man that built it. The tabernacle that the Lord pitched is you and me, because the Bible says, know ye not that your bodies are the temple of the living God. So our bodies are the true tabernacle. So the things that are shown by the Old Testament patterns of the tabernacle and sanctuary teach us about ourselves and our relationship with God. Verse 3 said, for every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man, Jesus, have somewhat also to offer. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests already that offer gifts according to the law. So, in other words, on earth, there's a priesthood, and it comes through Aaron, the tribe of Levi, the descendants of Aaron. That's the priesthood on earth. So he doesn't qualify under that earthly priesthood lineage, but his priesthood is deeper than that. He's gone on to the heavens. And that's what it was saying in verse 1. He is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. So because he's there, he can have a priesthood. He's not bound by the limitations of the earthly priesthood. And his priesthood can supersede that priesthood. Verse 5 says, who serve, talking about the earthly, who serve unto the example and the shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, God, that thou, Moses, make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. So this is the writer of the book of Hebrews impressing upon us the fact that the Old Testament rituals and the Old Testament laws and the Old Testament objects of religion are given to represent the spiritual and the personal that is in our relationship with God. This is him telling us we can look to those Old Testament things to learn about our relationship with God. Verse 6 says, but now hath he obtained, Jesus obtained, a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. And he slips in the word mediator here instead of the word priest as a descriptor of the function of the priest, because the priest offers sacrifice to God on behalf of the sinner. That's a mediator. A mediator is someone who provides a meeting between two parties and brings them together. Oftentimes, a mediator takes two parties who are opposed, and the role of the mediator is to bring them into unity with each other, at least give them the opportunity to come into unity with each other. But it's to bridge a gap between two parties. That's part of what priesthood is all about, bridging that gap, because humans are not like God, and God is not like people. And so there's a gap there. But Jesus Christ, being God manifest in the flesh, is the mediator that can provide a meeting place and a conduit and an avenue for us to connect to God. So he's the mediator of a better covenant. The earthly priests, the earthly mediators, were really not able, by their sacrifices, to facilitate a true connection between people and God. The promises that were given then were valuable, but the new promises are better promises. The new covenant is a better covenant. The new mediator is a better mediator. Our opportunity is better than what was back then. Verse 7 said, for if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For if that first covenant, oh, I didn't mean to have this on both pages, but I do. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. First covenant, second covenant, right? Or you can also say old covenant, new covenant. The word covenant is somewhat interchangeable. The meaning is not exactly the same. There's some overlap in meaning, but there's usage in the Bible where the word covenant is somewhat interchangeable with the word testament. And this is the case here. We could as easily say the first testament had been faultless. There should no place have been sought for the second testament. Old covenant, new covenant, Old Testament, New Testament. The word testament in this Old Testament, New Testament may be more familiar to us because we've labeled the biggest sections of our Bible as Old Testament, New Testament. What's really significant, though, is not just a part of a book and a different part of a book. What's significant is what's contained in those parts. And that in what we call the Old Testament, there is the giving of the first covenant, the Old Testament being that covenant. In the pages of our New Testament, we have the giving of the actual New Testament, which is the new covenant between us and God, at least offered to us to come into covenant with God. So old and new, first and second. For finding fault with them, with the old, God saith, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. This passage I've put over here, Jeremiah 31. I know the print is pretty small on your screen, but it's verses 31 to 34. This is the passage that he is quoting as he writes in Hebrews. He's basically writing down what's in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. He says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And this is one where he quotes it pretty close to word for word. As a quick reminder or clarification of something, oftentimes when a New Testament writer or New Testament speaker in the book of Acts or something quotes the Old Testament, which they do a lot, sometimes there's noticeable differences in the words that are said. And the reason for that is because of the language translations, or at least one reason. One reason for that is because of the language translations. When we read the Old Testament in our Bible, when we go back and look up, well, what was he quoting, like we're doing here, and we read it in our Bible, generally, we're reading English sentences that have been translated from Hebrew when they were originally written in Hebrew. But at the time that the New Testament was written, the Hebrew Bible had been translated into Greek, and that was more used for their communications. And so we're finding them referring to the Greek translation and writing it in Greek, and then we're taking that and translating that into English. And, anytime you go from one language to another, there are going to be variations and options for how certain things could be said. So just be aware that's when you do see those differences, that's not this person misquoting the Old Testament. It's just the way these things get morphed from one language to another. Now, there are other times that a New Testament writer or a New Testament speaker may be referring back to an Old Testament passage, but to an extent might paraphrase. And there's nothing wrong with that either. So sometimes they're not necessarily even trying to give a word for word quote, but they're referring back to it and paraphrasing to some extent. But this is really, really, really close here, the way it comes out in Hebrews 8 compared to Jeremiah 31. Okay, so this is a cool passage to understand because this is there are a lot of Old Testament prophecies about the New Testament era and the New Testament relationship with God. This is one that specifically labels it as a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. So it's a summary of the key of what this covenant is all about. So then he says, it's not according, or it's not the same as the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. When was that? Who was the human leader at the time? Moses. They left Egypt. They went to Mount Horeb, and they were given the law. They were given the 10 Commandments and then all the rest of the law. They were given the tabernacle, all of these ritualistic symbols, the priest's garments, and all of these things were given on this journey when they left Egypt. So that's the Old Testament. That's the Old Testament religion, the Old Testament practices. But he says, I'm going to change it, and I'm going to make it where it's different than that one. Why? because they continued not in my covenant, and then I regarded them not. I couldn't stay unified with them because they didn't continue in my covenant. So, in other words, it didn't work. It didn't work. So, I'm going to give them something better than what I gave them at the time. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. If you buy a novel, there's a little blurb in the front jacket that summarizes the key of what the novel is all about. This is the blurb of the New Testament. This is what the New Testament is all about. There are a lot of extra details, there's a lot of depth and insight and application, but this is what it is all about. The New Testament that Jesus died to implement and to introduce is about God putting laws inside of us, his principles, his ways inside of us, instead of just on paper or stone for us to look at and try to attain to. He's going to put it inside of us and change our nature and transform us to be like him and to know him. To know is to have a relationship, and we got to know God, and we have the opportunity to know God no matter who we are, from the least to the greatest, because God is going to be merciful. That's critical component, because God is a holy God and cannot have fellowship with sin and unrighteousness. And so he's going to wash them away and by the blood of Jesus, and be merciful to us, and not hold the eye to eye or eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth principle when we get our sins washed away. This is the New Testament that we get to live in, that Jeremiah got to predict and talk about what would ultimately come, but Jesus made that transition, and now we get to enjoy this opportunity, whosoever will, if we will respond to the invitation, if we will come boldly unto the throne of grace. This is the opportunity that we have to receive. And it's not an imaginary thing. It's not something we can only talk about. It's something that's real. When you get a hold of it, it has a real impact on your thinking and on your life. If you don't have an experience yet that has had that kind of real impact, seek God for it. Continue to knock and approach and come boldly to the throne and pray and ask, because it's for you. If you haven't had it yet, it's for you, and you can and will if you approach God with the kind of faith that doesn't give up. The last verse of this chapter, it's only 13 verses long. In that he saith a new covenant, he hath made the first old. And that in that he saith a new covenant, I went ahead and included verse 8 because that's where he said that. So he's made the first old. New covenant, old covenant. New Testament, Old Testament. It wasn't the Old Testament when they lived in it. It was the new one then. It was the only one. But because he used the word new to refer to the upcoming one, that implies the other one is the old, the new and the old, the first and the second, or the old, second and the first. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away, this writer says. So it's to be done away with. Now I'm just going to throw in here a quote from Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, where he says, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. So the old covenant, Old Testament, passes away and is replaced with the new, but it's not just a destruction of, it's a fulfillment of. And I just want to have that concept in our mind, not to get into a lot of particulars on that right now, but just for concept's sake. So that's the framework that the New Testament is introduced under. Chapter 9 gets into some, we pointed out there that he's saying there are allegories, there are parallels to look at and to learn from. Chapter 9 gives us some of those specifically, and so we will get into that next time.